Hello there. My name is Courtney Walker. I'm the Stormwater Program Manager for Douglas County, and I work for Douglas County Public Works. I'm going to give an update on work that the Stormwater Management Program has been conducting in the Johnson Lane area to address some of the long-standing flood issues in the area. So for the Johnson Lane area, we've had several flash flood events over the years. It's a pretty infilled development now. It's densely developed. And so therefore we needed to figure out how we could address all these drainage problems with all of the existing homes in the area and little open space around it within the subdivision. So we decided to do the Johnson Lane Area Drainage Master Plan. We partnered with CWSC and they obtained FEMA funding for us to do the drainage master planning. So I'm going to go through that process and some of the things that came out of the drainage master plan. And then I'm also going to talk about the Johnson Lane Settlement Agreement projects that are contained within that. There was litigation against Douglas County by some residents in the area. So I'm going to give an update on what came out of that. I'll talk a little bit about the timeline for the implementation of the drainage master plan, and then some next steps beyond the litigation and that implementation. So for those of you that may not be very familiar with the Johnson Lane area, there's several water courses that flow through the developed area. There's 12 different washes that flow through, and so you can imagine it's a bit of a challenge to deal with all of the runoff once it gets into the developed area. So this was kind of the first thing that our consultants, J.E. Fuller, looked into, was identifying all the different water courses that flow through the subdivision. And next we'll get to the amount of flows that they carry and what types of alternatives could be implemented. Here's a few of the issues that were occurring. We had roads washing out, a couple feet of water in roadways. A few homes were damaged by floodwaters, and several homes with landscaping were just covered in sediment, mud, water, etc. In this video, I'd like to play for you a video to see the amount of water that's actually flowing through these properties right up next to us. So here's the Johnson Lane Area Drainage Master Plan recommendations. They essentially broke up the water flow and the different washes that flow through the area into 4 different main systems, 5 really if you count the unnamed wash A. So there's 5 different systems, and what we're going to focus on for the most of this presentation is this area in purple, and that is called the Pine Nut North system. So in these 5 different systems, they conducted a prioritization of which ones would you want to do first. There's a lot of recommendations in the plan, and so you really want to figure out where do you get your most bang for the buck. Where do you help the most amount of people for the least amount of money? And so if you look at it like that, the Pine Nut North system is the highest priority because it protects the second largest number of buildings at a lower cost than Hot Springs Buckbrush. And the Hot Springs Buckbrush system helps the most amount of people, although it is quite expensive. The second priority that they had put down was a dam for the Johnson Lane Wash. And we'll talk in a minute about how that may not be the second highest priority for Douglas County. The Hot Springs Buckbrush system is the third priority. It does protect the largest number of buildings. However, it is the most expensive to implement. Pine Nut South and unnamed Wash A benefit the least number of buildings, but there is some benefit to doing them at some point in time. So here's kind of the price tags that we're looking at. For the Hot Springs Buckbrush system, it's about $8 million. For the Pine Nut North system, it's $880,000, somewhat obtainable for those 4 basins. The Johnson Lane Wash Dam is $4.9 million. However, we would prefer to not put that as the second priority because all of these improvements will ultimately be constructed on BLM land, and getting the environmental approvals to build a dam on BLM land will be very challenging, and we're actually not even sure if they're feasible, if that will ever be feasible to be approved on their property. So just to kind of break out the costs, it helps to look at each system's individual components so you can figure out trying to bite off sizable chunks. When you look at $8 million or $1 million or $4 million, it looks pretty unobtainable. But if you can break them out into each detention basin or each system, then it starts to look like something you might be able to wrap your mind around finding the money to do. So the Pine Nut North here, they recommend that we do the 25-year systems. So you can see the 4 basins broken out there. And then the Hot Springs Buckbrush systems, those are a little bit more expensive, and they do function as a system, so that will be something we look into in the future. Here's just a quick snapshot showing some of the existing depths that are going through the community. We have upwards of 2 to 3 feet. Some of these areas in red are existing detention areas, which is why they're deeper. But it's quite a bit of water that's flowing through the community, pretty uncontrolled, and causing a lot of problems for certain areas. And so those are some of the people that we want to try to help with some of these issues. So we're going to go into the Johnson Lane flood litigation settlement project. As I mentioned earlier, there was litigation against Douglas County. A group of 30 homeowners got together and formed a lawsuit against the county. It was just recently settled last summer in 2020, or maybe it was 2019 that they settled it. It's been a long process. And as a part of the settlement agreement, you'll see the Romero Wash Detention Basin and the Stephanie Wash Detention Basin are mandated by Douglas County to construct. And those improvements are both planned to be on BLM land. Here's where it shows in the settlement agreement that the county will actually set aside the money for the installation of the 25-year Romero Retention Basin and the 25-year Stephanie Retention Basin. We do have 15% design plans for each basin, so we know relatively well where they're going to be, what they're going to look like, and we have an idea of the actual footprints of them. We just know that these will change as we get into the 100% design, and I'll explain that a little more in a minute. So in addition to the county being required to construct the Stephanie and the Romero detention basins, the county also needed to set aside $302,250 into a separate account, and this would be used for projects that the plaintiffs could request outside of the J.E. Fuller Drainage Master Plan, or it could be within the Drainage Master Plan. But any project that they could show would be a regional flood protection benefit to the Johnson Lane area. So basically, they didn't want to commit all of their funds into the Drainage Master Plan because they believe there are other projects that could occur in the neighborhood that would benefit them in addition to the Drainage Master Plan that was conducted. So I didn't know much about their ideas when I had initially heard of this extra account of $300,000 until one of the plaintiffs submitted a project to be considered for these funds. So we had a court hearing, and I reviewed their proposal, and essentially they were asking if we could install an Arizona crossing, which is basically large box culverts, connecting the street with their 2 driveways. Or they were asking if we could install a very large culvert to replace the one in their main driveway and then installing an Arizona wash at the second driveway. So as I reviewed their proposal, I'm thinking, okay, these funds may be spent for projects that can show a regional flood protection benefit. But I couldn't quite see how it would help more additional homeowners than just the ones that were requesting this project. So that led me to having several meetings and discussions with the plaintiffs and trying to work through some of these issues. So I want to go into a little bit of some of the things that we came up with. So in our negotiations with the plaintiffs, I really needed to hear from them and hear from their opinions on what they thought the plan would do and what they thought the plan would not do. And when the consultants were putting together the plan, they were directed to provide any improvements that could be constructed on public land, because we know that that is probably going to be feasible. If you propose something on private land, the current owner may not want to sell, and the project may not be feasible based on the land ownership. So everything was based on essentially BLM land, which does help immensely because it gets all of the runoff in these washes. It traps it upstream of the subdivision, and that helps a very big problem that is occurring. However, there are additional runoff areas that are generated by the developed area that is also could be causing additional issues in the neighborhood. And so those were some of the discussions that we had. I did get the plaintiffs to compromise a bit to dedicate $200,000 of that $300,000 pot of funds to complete the Pine Nut North system. So in addition to installing the Romero Wash Detention Basin and the Stephanie Wash Detention Basin, we will also make a good faith effort to dedicate $200,000 to the Chowbuck Wash Detention Basin as well as the Skyline Wash Detention Basin, and the county will make a good faith effort to come up with the additional funds needed to install those additional two basins. So I just wanted to show this this picture. This is our proposed depth and flow through the subdivision once we have installed all 4 of those detention basins. So as you can see, we're still left with less than a foot, in some areas about a foot of runoff going through people's yards, which is still an issue. So we want to make sure that we can address some of these remaining problems even once we are able to contain the upstream runoff from above the developed area. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more here so that you can see some of the impacts that are still occurring even after you put in those detention basins. And that's really the biggest concern. Is this going to fix everything? No, it's not going to fix everything. So are there additional projects that we should consider and that we should talk about? Here's kind of the side-by-side, existing versus proposed. And as you can see, while the basins do help immensely, we still do have an issue in some areas, and we don't want to leave some people with a problem even after we do what we think is enough. So in the negotiations with the plaintiffs, we basically decided that the Douglas County will use reasonable efforts to identify a 1-acre parcel somewhere within the area of Pamela Place, East Valley, that sort of area, Amber Rose, etc., to contain some of the runoff you saw in the previous slide. And with that 1-acre parcel, we would then construct a detention basin to retain that stormwater runoff. And so this has kind of been a long-standing problem, and so I agree with them through our talks that I could understand where they're coming from, that although it is of great benefit to install the upstream basins, it will also be of great benefit to try to identify a parcel within the subdivision where we can contain existing flows from the developed area. So that is what we're going to work towards doing, and I'll be happy to provide an update on that in a year or two when we get rolling with that. So I wanted to kind of give you a timeline on where we're at today. So far, we are working with BLM to be able to get their approval to construct these basins on their land. So the first step was to apply for a right-of-way, which was done in October of 2019. As of right now, we're going through the NEPA process to complete an environmental assessment. We're hopeful that that will be completed by the spring of 2022. And per the settlement agreement, once we have the approval from BLM to be able to construct the improvements on their land, we have 9 months from that date to actually get them constructed. So once they give us the green light, we have a contract in place with Loomis and Associates to bring the plans for those 4 basins that we're going to be installing from 15% design up to 100% design. And then once we have the design and we can put everything out for bid, then we're hoping in the summer or fall of 2022 to construct all 4 detention basins using the same contractor. And then ongoing, we will continue to make good faith efforts for a drainage easement and acquiring that parcel for the 1 acre detention basin. So that will kind of be our next step after that. However, after we're done satisfying the settlement agreement, our work is not complete. There's still other areas of Johnson Lane and other recommendations that were in the plan. So I just wanted to go through really quickly our next steps for implementation after the settlement agreement and proposed order are completed. Trying to do some long-term planning. So after that, our next priority would be to start tackling the hot springs buckbrush system. So we know it is a system that functions together, and so essentially what we want to try to do is figure out through the modeling what would be a proper and safe order to implement these improvements, knowing that we can't do them all at once. So if we had to do them as piecemeal, what happens if you put in Southeast Wash Sediment Basin and then Johnson Lane Park Detention Basin? What's the order that you would want to logically put these in so that you're not causing moving one problem from another, from one area to another? So basically, we have obtained the drainage easement from this existing open channel in Saratoga Springs. And so once all the hot springs buckbrush system is in, it will go through a storm drain pipe and ultimately be charged to that ditch. And then Douglas County will be in control and have maintenance responsibilities over the entire system. This is probably realistically in our 20-year plan to have all of these things completed. Here's the price tag again for each one of these systems, quite high. So we really want to know, if we can knock out one a year or one every 2 years, then we have a shot at getting ahead of some of these things. And with that, I obviously can't take questions at this exact moment, but I will be available on the Zoom for Watershed Wednesday. And thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Feel free to contact me at the phone number below or email anytime.